Come in, close the door behind you, take a seat. The city is quiet tonight, but the files are never empty. You are safe here in the precinct, away from the noise, away from the lights. Tonight, we are looking at a ghost, a man who stepped onto a plane, ordered a bourbon, and then walked into the sky, never to be seen again. Relax your shoulders, let your eyes get heavy. Focus only on the evidence. The case file reads, D.B. Cooper. The rain in the Pacific Northwest possesses a specific weight, a heaviness that does not simply fall but seems to press the world closer to the ground. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, that rain was falling in sheets over the tarmac of Portland International Airport, drumming a relentless, hypnotic rhythm against the aluminum skins of the aircraft waiting at the gates. The air was thick, carrying the heavy, industrial perfume of unburnt jet fuel, mixed with the sharp, organic scent of damp pine needles decaying in the nearby forests. It was Thanksgiving Eve, a day usually reserved for the warmth of family and the noise of reunion. But here, on the runway, there was only the gray, monotone wash of a storm that had settled into the valley like a permanent resident. Amidst this gray backdrop, a man walked toward the ticket counter of Northwest Orient Airlines. He was not a figure who commanded attention, nor did he seem to wish for it. Rather, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a shadow passing through a dimly lit room. He wore a dark suit, ill-fitting by modern standards, but standard for the era. A lightweight black raincoat that shed the water in rivulets, and dark sunglasses that hid eyes which, according to the witnesses who would later spend hours trying to recall them, betrayed absolutely no emotion. He carried a black attaché case, the contents of which would soon turn a routine domestic flight into one of the most enduring riddles of the 20th century. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. This is not a story of violence, for there was no bloodshed, no voices raised in anger, and no weapon fired. Instead, we must frame this event as an impossible physics problem, a locked room mystery where the room is a pressurized tube traveling at 170 knots, and the escape route leads not into a hallway, but into a freezing void. How does a man, bound by the laws of gravity and aerodynamics, step out of a machine at 10,000 feet and simply erase himself from the historical record? Tonight, we do not chase a ghost through the dark woods, breathless and anxious. Instead, we will sit quietly with the evidence that remains. We will sort through the atoms, the microscopic fibers, and the faded flight paths until the chaos of that night settles into a perfect, silent order. We will examine the mechanics of the aircraft, the weave of the parachute nylon, and the geological layers of the riverbank where the only trace of him was ever found. We are here to observe, to catalog, and to understand. Let us begin with the inventory of the man who called himself Cooper. To understand the anomaly, we must first understand the mundane, for it is in the ordinary details that the truth often hides. The ticket he purchased was a standard issue document of the time, printed on paper that felt thick and fibrous to the touch, the red carbon copy leaving a faint residue on the fingers. Flight 305, Seat 18C, a one-way journey to Seattle. The cost was $20, paid in cash from a wallet that surely contained the mundane debris of a life. Receipts, reminders, perhaps a photograph, but which we will never see. He boarded the Boeing 727-100, an aircraft that we will come to know intimately tonight. He settled into the rear of the plane, a smoking section that would have been hazy with the blue-gray exhaust of Raleigh cigarettes, a brand he smoked with a steady, rhythmic cadence. He ordered a bourbon and soda. The stewardess, Florence Schaffner, later recalled that his hands were calm when he paid for the drink, his pulse visible only in the steady movement of his wrist as he handed her a note. When we strip away the myth, we are left with the behavior of a man who treated a hijacking not as a crime, but as a transaction. He did not scream. He did not threaten the passengers. He simply sat in the quiet hum of the cabin, sipping his drink, while the note he passed to Florence rested on her tray, a small rectangular piece of paper that carried the weight of a bomb threat. Even then, he was polite. When she ignored the note, assuming it was a proposition, he leaned forward and whispered, with a voice that was described as smooth and unaccented, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The hours that followed were a procedural ballet of negotiation and logistics, played out over radio frequencies that crackled with the static of the storm. Cooper requested $200,000 in negotiable American currency and 4 parachutes. He did not ask for a getaway driver or a cleared runway. He asked for the tools of physics. He was calculating drag, descent rates, and weight distribution. Let us pause to visualize the machine that encased him. The Boeing 727-100 is a tri-jet narrow-body airliner, a marvel of mid-century engineering designed for short to medium-haul routes. Its distinctive feature, and the one that made this event possible, was the ventral air stair, a set of stairs located at the rear of the fuselage, under the tail, which could be lowered during flight. This apparatus was controlled by a hydraulic system that hummed with a specific frequency when activated, a sound Cooper may have been listening for. The stairs were designed to allow passengers to board at small airports without ground support equipment, a convenience that became a loophole. Once the plane landed in Seattle, the exchange was made. The passengers, unaware of the shadow that had been sitting among them, were released into the cold night air. The fuel trucks arrived, their heavy hoses connecting to the wings, pumping thousands of gallons of Jet A fuel into the tanks, the smell of kerosene overpowering the scent of the rain. Cooper remained on board, outlining his flight plan to the crew. He demanded they fly south towards Mexico City, but at a very specific configuration. The landing gear was to remain deployed, the wing flaps set to 15 degrees, and the cabin was to remain unpressurized. These settings are crucial to our understanding, because they transformed the sleek jet into a slow-moving platform. With the gear down and flaps extended, the drag coefficient increased significantly, forcing the pilots to keep the engines running harder just to maintain a speed of approximately 170 knots. The altitude was capped at 10,000 feet, a height where the air is breathable without oxygen masks, though biting cold. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the 727 took off again, rising into a sky that was absolute black. Cooper was now alone in the rear of the cabin. The flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, had retreated to the cockpit as instructed. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting long, shifting shadows across the empty seats. Now, we enter the phase of the forensic deconstruction. We must look at the physical evidence left behind, the silent testimony of objects that witnessed the final moments. On seat 18E, Cooper left a black clip-on tie. It was a cheap accessory, sold at J.C. Penney, the kind worn by men who worked around machinery where a long tie could be a hazard. In the years since, this tie has been subjected to the most rigorous scientific interrogation imaginable. In 2011, electron microscopes scanned its fabric, looking for dust that might reveal the man's identity. The list of particles found on that tie reads like a geological survey of the industrial age. We find titanium, a metal used in advanced aerospace engineering. We find herium and strontium sulfide. We find pure aluminum particles. These are not the dust of a common thief. They are the fingerprints of a high-tech environment. They suggest a man who walked the floors of a Boeing plant, or perhaps a chemical facility, breathing in the microscopic byproducts of innovation. The tie tells us he was likely an engineer or a manager, someone comfortable with technical specifications, someone who understood that the world is built of components that can be disassembled. At 8:00 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The aft air stair had been unlatched. The hydraulic seal was broken, and the roar of the engines would have grown louder in the rear cabin as the door cracked open. The temperature outside was 7 degrees below 0 Celsius. The wind chill would have been instant and numbing. Imagine the sensory experience of standing at the top of those stairs. Behind you, the warm, dry air of the cabin. Ahead of you, a roaring tunnel of wind and rain. The noise would have been deafening, a constant physical pressure against the eardrums. Below, nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the Washington wilderness. A vast carpet of Douglas fir and hemlock trees, their branches heavy with water. At 8:13 p.m., the crew in the cockpit felt a sudden, slight oscillation in the airframe. It was a pressure bump, a momentary shift in the plane's center of gravity. This was the moment the physics equation was balanced. A mass of approximately 170 pounds had detached from the aircraft. Cooper was gone. He fell into a wind stream traveling at 200 miles per hour. The terminal velocity of a human body in a flat, stable fall is roughly 120 miles per hour, but with a parachute that is not yet deployed, the acceleration is rapid. He would have tumbled into the freezing mist, the sound of the jet engines fading quickly into the distance, replaced by the rushing wind. Did the parachute open? We must look at the equipment. He had been given 4 parachutes, 2 primary chutes and 2 reserves. In his haste, or perhaps by design, he took the NB-8 rig, a military-grade parachute, but he accidentally selected a reserve chute that was merely a dummy, a training unit sewn shut, useless for flight. He left the functional reserve on the plane. This detail adds a layer of quiet tragedy to the puzzle. Did he realize, as he plummeted through the cloud layer, that his backup was simply cloth and thread, incapable of saving him? The search that followed was one of the most extensive in history, yet it yielded a silence so profound it seemed almost deliberate. For years, the forests kept their secret. The tall trees stood watch, their roots buried deep in the soil, undisturbed. The seasons turned. Winter snows covered the drop zone, melting into spring creeks that fed the Columbia River. Summer heat dried the mud. Autumn leaves fell, layer upon layer, burying the forest floor in a slow, decomposing blanket of time. It was not until 1980, 9 years later, that the Earth gave up a piece of the puzzle. A young boy named Brian Ingram, digging a fire pit on the sandy banks of the Columbia River at a place called Tennebar, unearthed 3 bundles of rotting cash. The bills were $20 denominations, their serial numbers matching the ransom money. Let us examine the condition of this money with the detachment of a forensic geologist. The bills were not loose, they were still bound in rubber bands, though the rubber had crumbled. The paper was saturated, the edges rounded by the abrasive action of sand and water. They smelled of river mud and decay. The diatoms, microscopic algae found in the water, embedded in the fibers of the bills, told a story of seasonal submersion. The money had not arrived at Tennebar immediately. It had traveled. Perhaps it had floated down a tributary, carried by the snowmelt, drifting slowly, silently, until it lodged in the sandbar, buried by the shifting sediments of the river. The money is the only proof we have that he returned to the earth. But where is the man? The logic of the woods is simple. Everything returns to the soil. A suit made of wool and polyester would eventually degrade, though the synthetic fibers might persist for decades. The leather shoes would harden and crack. The bones, scattered by scavengers or buried by falling debris, would become indistinguishable from the bleached branches of fallen timber. There is a theory, quiet and plausible, that Cooper did not survive the jump. That the freezing wind, the brutal impact of landing in a dense forest at night, and the inadequate clothing conspired to end his journey swiftly. In this version of events, there is no master criminal sipping cocktails on a tropical beach. There is only the silence of the forest, reclaiming what fell from the sky. The nitrogen in his body would eventually feed the roots of a western hemlock. The calcium of his bones would dissolve into the acidic soil. He became, in the most literal sense, part of the landscape he vanished into. And so, the file remains open, but the activity has ceased. The FBI has shelved the case. The agents who once scoured the grid maps have retired. The frantic energy of the investigation has dissipated, replaced by the static of history. The numbers are recorded. The evidence is boxed. The mystery has been managed, organized, and stored away in a climate-controlled room where the air is still and the lights are low. As we drift further from that night in 1971, the sharp edges of the event have worn smooth, like the river stones at Tennebar. The anxiety of the unknown has been replaced by the comfort of the unknowable. We can rest in the certainty that some puzzles are not meant to be solved, but simply observed. The forest floor where the money rested is quiet now. The moss grows slowly, creeping over stones and fallen logs in a process that takes years to cover inches. The pine needles fall, one by one, creating a soft, damp bed that absorbs all sound. The river flows endlessly toward the sea, a constant rhythmic movement of water over rock. Winter turns to spring. Spring fades into summer. The cycle repeats, methodical and slow. The plane has long since landed. The engines have cooled, the metal contracting with a series of soft, ticking sounds. The lights in the cabin are dimming, one by one. The aisle is empty. The seats are still. The rain continues to fall on the tarmac, washing away the dust, leaving only the reflection of the night sky, drifting into silence. To understand the anomaly, we must first ground ourselves in the physical reality of the objects that accompanied him, for it is often in the inventory of the mundane that the truth quietly resides. Let us turn our attention to the ticket, a small rectangular artifact of travel that, in 1971, possessed a tactile weight and a chemical complexity that modern digital passes entirely lack. The airline ticket of that era was not merely a permission to board. It was a booklet of carbon-layered paper, a physical record pressed by impact. Imagine the texture of the stock, slightly rough, fibrous, and cool to the touch. It was composed of a top sheet for the agent, a middle sheet for the audit, and a bottom sheet for the passenger, each separated by a delicate film of carbon that transferred the pressure of the pen into a permanent indigo mark. When Dan Cooper purchased this ticket at the counter, the clerk's pen would have scratched across the surface, embedding the ink into the fibers, creating a microscopic topography of ridges and valleys that documented his intent. We must read the details of this document slowly, allowing each data point to settle in the mind like dust settling in a quiet room. Flight 305, seat 18, C, destination Seattle. Time 16:35, status one way. There is a specific bureaucratic rhythm to these numbers, a cadence of logistics that governs the movement of bodies through the air. He held this booklet in hands that were steady, perhaps folding it once, sliding it into the interior pocket of a suit jacket that we must now examine with the scrutiny of a textile scientist. The attire of the man in seat 18C was a uniform of anonymity, a business suit that served as perfect camouflage in the corporate landscape of the Pacific Northwest. In 1971, men's suits were undergoing a transition in material science, moving from the heavy, natural wools of the past to the blended synthetics of the future. It is highly probable that his suit was a wool-polyester blend, a fabric designed for durability and crease resistance, composed of fibers twisted together in a tight, plain weave. If you were to look closely at such a fabric under magnification, you would see the organic, scaled structure of the wool fibers interlocking with the smooth, extruded cylinders of the polyester, a combination that creates a textile capable of shedding wrinkles, but which offers very little thermal protection against the sub-zero temperatures he was about to face. Over this, he wore a raincoat. It was a dark, trench-style coat, likely made of a water-resistant gabardine or a rubberized cotton, the kind of material that makes a distinct low-frequency rustle when the wearer moves, a sound like dry leaves shifting over stone. On his feet he wore loafers, slip-on shoes made of cordovan or leather, with smooth soles designed for office corridors, not for the traction required on a wet, freezing aft air stair. But the most compelling item in his inventory, the object that speaks most clearly to his psychology, is the tie. He wore a narrow, black, clip-on tie. We must pause to consider the mechanics of a clip-on. Unlike a traditional necktie, which wraps around the throat and is secured by a knot of the wearer's making, a clip-on is a prefabricated facade, attached to the collar by a small metal clasp. In the world of forensic psychology and industrial safety, the clip-on tie is a specific marker. It is the preferred neckwear of men who work around heavy machinery, rotational motors, or blueprints where a dangling piece of fabric could become a fatal entanglement. A traditional tie, if caught in a gear or a conveyor belt, becomes a noose. A clip-on simply detaches, leaving the wearer safe. The choice of this tie suggests a man who calculated risk, a man who prioritized function over form, and who perhaps habitually dressed in a way that ensured he could not be tethered or trapped by his own clothing. He removed this tie before he jumped, leaving it on the seat, a shed skin, a deliberate disconnection from the identity he had assumed. As the plane taxied and the engines began their high-pitched whine, Cooper ordered a drink. Bourbon and soda. Let us deconstruct this beverage, not as a refreshment but as a chemical solution. The bourbon, an amber liquid distilled from corn and aged in charred oak barrels, contains ethanol, a depressant that typically slows the central nervous system. He poured it over ice. Imagine the thermal reaction as the warm spirit met the frozen water. The cracking sound of the ice cubes adjusting to the temperature shift. The release of small gas bubbles rising to the surface. The stewardess, trained to notice the subtle anxieties of flyers, the white-knuckled grip on the armrest, the rapid breathing, the excessive perspiration, observed none of these in Cooper. His physiology remained impossibly flat. As he sipped the bourbon, the condensation on the glass would have gathered in small, perfect beads, sliding down to wet his fingertips. Yet his heart rate, the engine of his own biology, seemingly did not accelerate. He sat in the window seat, watching the rain streak horizontally across the plexiglass. A man entirely contained within himself, surrounded by the inventory of his own disappearance. The paper ticket, the synthetic suit, the safety tie, and the glass of melting ice. Everything was in order. Every object had a purpose. And as the plane lifted into the gray ceiling of the sky, he was merely waiting for the moment when these objects would be put to their final use. To understand the escape, we must first understand the vessel. For the Boeing 727-100 is not merely a container for passengers but a complex assembly of aluminum ribs, hydraulic vanes, and electrical nerves. It is a machine born of a specific era in aeronautical engineering, a time when efficiency was paramount, yet the safeguards against human ingenuity were not yet fully realized. If we were to strip away the skin of the fuselage, we would see a skeleton designed for resilience, a frame capable of withstanding the immense stresses of flight, yet possessing a singular, fatal architectural quirk located at the very rear of the airframe. This quirk is the ventral air stair. Unlike modern aircraft, where boarding is conducted strictly through side doors connected to jet bridges, the 727 was designed to operate independently at smaller regional airports that lacked ground support. To achieve this, the engineers installed a retractable staircase in the tail, a heavy hinged ramp that lowered from the underside of the fuselage like the jaw of a great mechanical beast. We must look closely at the hydraulics of this system, specifically the actuators that govern its movement. In 1971, the mechanism was innocent of the device that would later bear the hijacker's name, the Cooper vane. This simple, spring-loaded paddle, which now prevents the stairs from lowering while the aircraft is in motion, did not exist. At that time, the only force keeping the stairs retracted during flight was a combination of hydraulic pressure and the aerodynamic load of the slipstream pushing up against the door. However, if the pilot were to reduce the speed, slowing the aircraft to the point where the drag coefficient dropped below a critical threshold, the air pressure holding the door shut would weaken. If one were to then override the electrical locks, the gravity of the stairs would overcome the resistance of the air, and the door would fall open, exposing the pressurized cabin to the raw atmosphere. This brings us to the hypnotic rhythm of the flight dynamics, a language of physics that Cooper seemed to speak fluently. The aircraft was not flying normally, it was laboring. The pilots had configured the plane to fly in a dirty state, a term that refers to the disruption of clean airflow. With the landing gear deployed and the flaps set to 15 degrees, the plane was fighting against the air rather than slicing through it. Consider the cabin pressurization differentials. In a standard flight, the cabin is pumped full of air to mimic the density of a lower altitude, pushing outward against the hull with tremendous force. But Cooper had ordered the cabin unpressurized. This equalization was vital. If he had attempted to open the door with a pressure differential, the door would have been sealed shut by tons of force, or, if breached, would have resulted in an explosive decompression. By equalizing the pressure, he turned the violent barrier of the door into a simple, heavy hinge, moving with the sluggish resistance of cold hydraulic fluid. We must also consider the yaw dampers. The 727, with its T-tail design, was prone to a Dutch roll, a rhythmic swaying motion where the tail wags from side to side. The yaw dampers are gyroscopic devices designed to smooth out this motion, keeping the flight path straight. As Cooper lowered the stairs, the disruption to the airflow would have confused these sensors, creating a subtle, vibrating feedback loop through the airframe. A shudder felt not as a danger, but as a mechanical complaint from a machine being forced to operate outside its envelope. The aircraft was now tracking a specific line through the sky, a highway made not of asphalt, but of radio signals. This is Vector 23, or as the pilots called it, Victor 23. It is a low-altitude airway that threads its way south from Seattle towards Reno, a corridor of invisible beacons guiding the plane through the darkness. Let us visualize this path, not as a line on a map, but as a sequence of sleeping communities passing beneath the wings. The plane moved slowly, droning over the landscape at a ground speed of roughly 200 miles per hour. Below, the world was silent, the towns merely clusters of faint, amber streetlights obscured by the heavy cloud cover. We will read the geography of the flight path slowly, acknowledging the distance between each point. First, the dark, rushing water of the Lewis River. Then, the small, quiet grid of Washougal. Further south, the spread of Battleground. And finally, the dim lights of Orchards. Each of these towns was a collection of homes where families were finishing Thanksgiving preparations, unaware that 10,000 feet above their chimneys, a man was standing on the threshold of a void. The environment outside the plane was hostile to human life. We must process the data of the atmosphere. The altitude was 10,000 feet, a height where the air is thin, containing only about 2/3 of the oxygen found at sea level. A man breathing this air would remain conscious, but his cognitive functions would begin to slow, a subtle hypoxia that can induce a feeling of detachment or calm. The temperature outside the cabin was -7 degrees Celsius, but this number does not account for the movement of the air. When a body moves through air at 170 knots, the convective heat loss is catastrophic. The wind chill factor would have driven the effective temperature down to nearly negative 50 degrees. At this temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. The fluid in the eyes begins to thicken. The dexterity of the fingers, essential for pulling a ripcord, would vanish rapidly, replaced by the wooden, unresponsive numbness of severe hypothermia. Cooper stood on the stairs encased in a noise that is difficult to describe. Not a roar, but a physical wall of sound, a white noise so absolute that it erased all thought. The engines, mounted high on the tail, were screaming, but the sound was being carried away behind him. The primary sound was the wind, the shearing of air molecules against the aluminum ramp. He was a man in a business suit, suspended in a freezing, deafening, mechanical limbo, waiting for the precise intersection of geography and physics that would allow him to step off the edge of the world. We must now turn our gaze to the specific tools of his descent, for in the world of aerial mechanics, a parachute is not merely a piece of fabric. It is a complex assembly of drag and resistance designed to contradict the absolute certainty of gravity. Cooper had demanded 4 parachutes, 2 primary backpacks, and 2 chest-mounted reserves, creating a surplus that allowed him to make a choice. This choice was not random, it was technical. He was provided with a variety of gear, including a Pioneer Sport parachute, which was steerable, and a military-grade NB-8 rig. The Sport chute offered control, a way to navigate the wind currents, yet he left it behind on the seat, opting instead for the NB-8. This decision speaks to a preference for reliability over maneuverability. The NB-8 is a beast of burden, a 28-foot canopy made of olive-drab nylon, designed not for the grace of skydiving, but for the brutal utility of emergency ejection. Let us visualize the material itself. The canopy is constructed of ripstop nylon, a fabric woven with a reinforcing technique where a thicker yarn is interlaced at regular intervals in a crosshatch pattern. If you were to run your hand across it, you would feel the tiny raised grid, a microscopic architecture designed to stop a tear from spreading. The suspension lines, the white cords that connect the harness to the silk, are Type 3 nylon, known commonly as 550 cord, because each line has a tensile strength of 550 pounds. They are composed of a braided outer sheath and an inner core of twisted yarns, a structure that provides a slight elasticity, absorbing the violent shock of opening. Before he stepped into the night, Cooper performed a final, strange act of modification. He took one of the reserve chutes, not the one he intended to wear, but the extra, and he destroyed it. He needed cord to secure the heavy bag of money to his body, and so he unsheathed the blade. Listen closely to the sensory detail of this moment. Cutting through high-strength nylon suspension lines is not a silent task. It requires a sawing motion. The blade would have bitten into the braided sheath, creating a distinct dry rasping sound, followed by the high-pitched snap as the tension in the inner core released. He severed the lines one by one, gathering the white rope, the sound of tearing fabric barely audible over the drone of the engines, a private, methodical destruction in the dim light of the cabin. With the money secured and the NB-8 strapped to his back, he moved to the stairs. At exactly 8:13 p.m., the crew in the cockpit, isolated behind the closed door, felt a physical anomaly. It was recorded in the flight logs not as a sound, but as a sensation, a pressure bump. To understand this bump, we must look at the physics of the airframe. The Boeing 727, flying with the aft stairs down, is an aerodynamic system in a delicate state of balance. The stairs act as a massive air brake, dragging against the slipstream, and the weight of a man standing at the very end of that ramp acts as a lever, pulling the tail slightly downward. When Cooper jumped, he removed approximately 170 pounds of mass from the very tip of that lever instantly. The aircraft, suddenly relieved of this weight, pitched up. The stairs, no longer held down by his boots, were slammed upward by the force of the wind, rebounding against the hydraulics. It was a single, mechanical shudder, a silent communication from the rear of the plane that the passenger was no longer on board. Now, we must calculate the physics of that transition. Cooper did not simply fall. He entered a violent fluid stream. The aircraft was traveling at 170 knots, which is roughly 195 miles per hour. When a human body exits a protected environment into an airstream of that velocity, the result is not the graceful float of a skydiver, but a collision with the atmosphere. The air at that speed behaves less like a gas and more like a solid wall. The drag force acting on his body would have been immediate and immense, a deceleration that would feel like a physical blow to the chest. He would have been tumbling, spinning in the chaotic wake of the jet engines, the turbulence tossing him like a leaf in a gale. Let us consider the mathematics of his freefall. Terminal velocity is the speed at which the force of gravity pulling a body down is perfectly equalized by the resistance of the air pushing it up. For a man of average build, falling belly to earth, this is approximately 120 miles per hour. However, Cooper was weighted down. He carried 21 pounds of money in a heavy parachute rig. This additional mass increases the terminal velocity, pulling him through the air faster, perhaps reaching speeds of 130 or 140 miles per hour. And finally, we must imagine the sound. Inside the plane, there was the mechanical hum of the engines. Outside, in the freefall, that hum would have vanished instantly, replaced by the roar of the wind. At 140 miles per hour, the wind noise is absolute. It is a frequency that overwhelms the auditory nerve, a roaring static that drowns out all other senses. He was falling through a cloud layer that was 3,000 feet thick. In this vapor, there is no visibility, no horizon, no stars, just a gray, wet void. He would not have known which way was up or down, save for the pull of the straps against his shoulders. He was a singular point of consciousness, wrapped in a business suit, plummeting through a freezing black sky, waiting for the ground that was rushing up to meet him at a rate of 176 feet per second. When the noise of the engines fades and the wind settles, what we are left with is silence. But in the world of forensic science, silence is not an absence of information. It is merely a repository of data waiting to be read. For 40 years, the physical traces of Dan Cooper sat in climate-controlled lockers, preserved in darkness, until technology advanced enough to listen to the microscopic whispers they contained. We must now turn our attention to the most intimate artifact left behind, the black clip-on tie found on seat 18E. For decades, this tie was viewed simply as an accessory, a piece of cheap fabric discarded in the moment of transformation. But in 2011, a team of private investigators and scientists, granted access by the FBI, subjected this object to a process known as scanning electron microscopy. This is the deepest form of looking. It is a technique that does not use light, which is too crude for this level of detail, but instead fires a focused beam of electrons at the surface of the object. These electrons interact with the atoms of the sample, producing signals that can be mapped into an image of the topography of dust. Imagine the tie not as fabric, but as a landscape. Every thread is a valley, every knot is a mountain range, and trapped within this landscape are the debris of a life. Using a sticky carbon stub, scientists lifted the invisible particles from the knot of the tie, particles that had settled there in 1971, preserved like insects in amber. What they found was a chemical signature so specific, so rare, that it acts almost as a GPS coordinate for Cooper's daily existence. I want you to listen to the list of elements found embedded in the weave. I will read them slowly, for each one is a clue to a specific industrial environment. Cerium, strontium, sulfide, titanium, pure, aluminum, yttrium. These are not the elements of a grocer or a banker. These are the exotic materials of the high-tech age. In 1971, pure titanium was a strategic metal used almost exclusively in military aircraft and corrosive chemical handling. Strontium sulfide and yttrium were rare earth elements used in the manufacturing of cathode ray tubes, the glowing screens of early radar and television sets. The presence of these particles suggests that Cooper spent his days in a very specific type of environment. He likely walked the floors of a facility where alloys were being ground, where sparks were flying, or where chemical baths were plating metal for aerospace components. The evidence points quietly but firmly toward the Boeing production lines, or the corridors of a high-tech contractor like Tektronix. It paints a portrait of a man who understood machines because he lived among them, breathing in the metallic dust of progress. Does it not make you wonder, as you sit here now, what microscopic stories are clinging to your own clothes? What dust from your day is settling on your collar, waiting to tell a future observer exactly where you have been and what you have touched? While the tie waited in the locker, the earth itself was slowly processing the only other evidence Cooper left behind. We must move forward in time now, drifting 9 years down the timeline to 1980. The setting is Tena Bar, a narrow strip of sandy beach along the Columbia River, miles downstream from the presumed drop zone. It was a cold February day when a young boy named Brian Ingram, while smoothing out the sand to build a fire pit, felt his fingers brush against something that was not rock nor wood, but yielding and soft. He unearthed 3 bundles of cash. The discovery was electric for the public, but for the forensic geologists it was a quiet triumph of stratigraphy. We must look at the soil layers of the riverbank to understand the journey of this money. The bills were not found on the surface. They were buried inches deep, encased in the sediment. The condition of the money tells the story of its travel. The bills were waterlogged, fused together by the pressure of the earth and the decay of the paper. The rubber bands that had once held them in neat stacks had crumbled away, destroyed by the oxygen and the ultraviolet light before the burial, or perhaps eaten by the bacteria in the soil, leaving only faint, sulfurous traces of their existence. The corners of the bills were rounded, abraded by the gentle, constant friction of sand and water. This rounding implies movement. The money did not fall from the sky directly onto Tina Bar. It traveled. It likely floated down the Washougal River, tumbling over the riverbed stones, drifting through the currents until it was caught in the natural snag of the sandbar. But the most profound testimony came from the invisible life within the paper. Upon microscopic examination, scientists found diatoms embedded in the fibers of the bills. Diatoms are single-celled algae with skeletons made of silica. They bloom in specific seasons. The species found on the money, Asterianella formosa, blooms in the spring. This biological timestamp suggests that the money entered the water, or was buried by the water, months after the hijacking. It implies a timeline where the money sat somewhere else, perhaps on a forest floor, perhaps in a tributary, before the spring thaw rose up and carried it away. It smells, even decades later, of rotting paper and river mud, a scent that is organic, heavy, and final. It is the smell of a man's ambition returning to the dirt, reclaimed by the slow, indifferent cycles of geology. The money at Tenabar is the only piece of the ransom ever found. $5,800 out of $200,000. The rest remains missing. Perhaps it is still out there, buried under 50 years of pine needles. Or perhaps it drifted out to the Pacific Ocean, dissolving slowly in the salt water, the serial numbers erasing one by one, until the debt was paid in full to the sea. We have spent this time together sifting through the debris, measuring the atoms on a tie and calculating the physics of a fall. But now we must step back to view the entirety of the mosaic. Over the decades, the mind has attempted to fill the silence of Dan Cooper's disappearance with noise, with elaborate theories of a successful escape, of a man living out his days in luxury on a tropical coast, or of a mastermind who outwitted the combined logic of the aviation industry and federal law enforcement. But these are stories for the waking mind, constructed to satisfy our need for a hero or a villain. When we look at the evidence through the dispassionate lens of forensic history, the violence of the event fades, and a quieter, more profound truth begins to emerge. It is highly probable that Cooper did not escape from the world, but rather that he escaped into it, becoming indistinguishable from the geography he plummeted toward. Consider the vastness of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, a landscape of ancient, dense growth that has swallowed aircraft, civilizations, and secrets for millennia without leaving a trace. If he did not survive the impact, as the aerodynamics and the elements suggest, then he was not a fugitive running from justice, but simply organic matter returning to the cycle of the forest. The nitrogen in his cells would have fed the roots of the Douglas firs. The fibers of his suit would have been woven into the nests of birds. The money he carried would have become indistinguishable from the wet, decaying leaves of the forest floor. He did not cheat the system, he merely exited it. Think of the event now not as a crime, but as a singular disturbance in a vast, quiet body of water. Like a stone falling into a deep lake, the splash was violent and sudden, creating waves that crashed against the shore for a time. But 40 years later, those ripples have long since faded. The energy has dissipated, and what we are left with is only the glass-smooth surface of the water, reflecting the sky unchanged and still. This stillness is formalized by the institutions that once hunted him. In July of 2016, the Federal Bureau of Investigation made a decision that offers us a final, comforting sense of order. They officially closed the investigation into the hijacking of Flight 305. The active hunt has ended. The agents who spent their careers chasing leads have retired to their own quiet lives. The resources have been redirected to the problems of the present. This administrative closure is a micro-resolution that allows the mind to rest. It signifies that the mystery is no longer active, it is managed. The case file, designated NORJAC, is no longer a living document on a desk, but a box on a shelf in the National Archives. The serial numbers of the bills are recorded in a database that rarely blinks. The DNA profiles are stored in a server that hums quietly in a temperature-controlled room. There is no danger left in this story, only history. The anxiety of the unknown has been categorized, labeled, and filed away. We do not need to solve the puzzle to find peace. We only need to acknowledge that the pieces have been gathered and put away for the night. The chaos of that November evening has been organized into a narrative that no longer requires our vigilance. The search is over, the sky is empty, and the file is closed. Now, as we release the tension of the riddle, allowing the questions to dissolve into the quiet of the past, we find our attention drifting back to the physical reality of the Pacific Northwest. We are no longer standing in the cold wind of the open-air stair, nor are we sitting under the fluorescent hum of the laboratory lights. Instead, we are settling into the deep, ancient stillness of the forest floor, where the evidence lay hidden for so long. Imagine, if you will, that small, secluded patch of earth near the riverbank, a place where the noise of the human world does not reach, and where the only sound is the gentle rhythmic movement of the natural world. The seasons here turn in a slow, repetitive cycle, a wheel of time that moves with a patience we can scarcely comprehend, shifting from the heavy gray rains of November into the deep, insulating silence of the winter snow. Underneath the canopy of the great Douglas firs, the light filters down in soft, shifting beams, touching the ground only briefly before the shadows lengthen and the twilight returns to claim the woods. The moss, thick and velvet green, creeps slowly over the river stones and the fallen logs, moving imperceptibly day by day, covering the sharp edges of the world with the soft, living blanket that absorbs the cold and dampens every sound. The pine needles fall from the branches above, drifting down through the still air, one by one. They land on the damp earth with no sound at all, adding another layer to the forest floor, burying the secrets of the past under a fragrant, decomposing carpet of time. Spring follows winter, melting the frost into small, clear rivulets that feed the river, and the ferns unfurl their green fronds in the warming air, only to fade again as the summer heat dries the mud, turning the wheel once more toward the autumn. It is a place of absolute rest, where nothing is demanded, where nothing is hurried, and where everything eventually settles into its proper place in the earth. If this journey into the quiet details of history has helped you find a sense of calm tonight, and if you wish to continue examining the silent puzzles of the past with us, you are welcome to subscribe to this channel, or perhaps share this quiet space with another who seeks rest in the details. But for now, The investigation is complete. The plane has landed. The engines have cooled. The lights in the cabin are dimming one by one. The night has reclaimed its secrets. Let the heavy curtain fall. The case is closed. Good night.